Welcome to The Explainer. So, there's this huge claim making the rounds online that pornography is literally changing the way we experience attraction. But what's the real story? What does the actual science have to say about it? Let's find out.
You've almost certainly heard some version of this idea, right? It's the core of a super viral TEDx talk that's racked up more than 14 million views. And the claim is a big one, that this endless fire hose of new faces online is fundamentally rewiring men's brains, changing how they respond to their real-world partners.
But is that popular theory really backed by hard science, or is it just a really compelling story? Well, that's exactly what a couple of researchers, Jordan Scully and Christopher Watkins, wanted to figure out. So they put it to the test.
Okay, so first things first, let's get our heads around the biological idea that this whole theory is built on. It actually comes from the world of animal behavior, which is pretty interesting.
It's called the Coolidge effect. And what researchers saw in all kinds of species is that a male who's kind of lost interest in mating with a familiar female will suddenly get a jolt of new motivation when a new female shows up. The big argument is that the internet acts like a super stimulus for this effect in us humans, giving us a literally endless supply of new mates.
Now, before we jump into the experiment itself, it's really important to understand why scientists are so careful with a loaded word like addiction, especially when they're talking about a behavior.
You see, here's the problem for researchers. There's just no universally agreed upon line where a common behavior, like watching porn, crosses over and becomes a medical problem, a pathology. It's not like a substance addiction where the science is more settled. For behaviors, the criteria are still being hotly debated.
So to be more precise, researchers use very specific terms. You've got hypersexual disorder, which is this big, broad umbrella for lots of different behaviors. And then under that umbrella, you have something specific like problematic online pornography use, or POPU. And the key thing here isn't about how much someone uses it, but whether that use is causing them real distress or messing up their life.
So what is it that makes online pornography so unique? Well, researchers often point to what they call the AAA factors. It's more accessible, more affordable, and more anonymous than it has ever been in human history. And this unique digital environment is exactly why scientists decided they needed to test its real-world effects on attraction.
Okay, so with all that scientific background in our back pocket, let's dive into the experiment that was designed to test this Coolidge effect theory head-on. They even cleverly called it the Great Porn Experiment V2.0.
The goal here was crystal clear. The scientists wanted to see if they could actually measure this supposed rewiring effect in a controlled lab. In other words, would looking at pornographic images actually make men less attracted to women they've already seen, and maybe more attracted to new ones?
So here's how they did it. It's pretty clever. First, a group of heterosexual men rated how attractive 10 images were. 5 faces, 5 bodies. That gave them a baseline. Then, they watched a 1-minute slideshow. After that, they had to rate the original 10 images again. Only this time, 10 brand new, novel images were mixed in. The real secret sauce was in what they saw during that 1-minute slideshow.
See, the men were split into 3 different groups, and each group saw a different kind of slideshow. The control group, they just saw attractive actresses fully clothed. A second group saw those same actresses, but this time they were nude. And a third group saw them engaged in intercourse, or what the study calls PVI. This whole setup was designed so the researchers could pinpoint the specific effect of increasingly explicit material.
And all of this led to the single biggest question of the entire experiment. Would those arousing pornographic slideshows make the men rate the familiar women, the ones they'd already seen and rated, as less attractive the second time around? Basically, was novelty gonna win?
Well, the results were absolutely fascinating. And what they found reveals this really critical difference between just being exposed to something and actually being sexually aroused. Okay, let's break this chart down. Look at the control group, the guys who saw the clothed photos. They actually rated the familiar women as being more attractive than the new ones. So familiarity was a plus. But now look at the high arousal groups, the ones who saw the nude and PVI slideshows. For them, that advantage that familiar women had, it almost completely vanished. The gap between how they rated familiar and novel women just shrank.
So, let me put that another way, because this is the key takeaway. Sexual arousal didn't actually make the new women seem more attractive. What it did was reduce the special status of the women the men were already familiar with. It kind of brought them down to the same level as all the new faces. But hold on, there's a twist that separates arousal from simple exposure. It turns out that just looking at any of the slideshows, even the totally non-arousing clothed one, made the men's ratings for the familiar bodies drop just a little bit from the first time to the second.
So that suggests that simply being exposed to images of highly attractive people has its own small separate effect, completely independent of nudity.
And to really nail down that sexual arousal was the key ingredient here, the researchers ran a follow-up study, this time with homosexual men who you wouldn't expect to be sexually aroused by female nudes. And, just as they predicted, while simple exposure still had some minor effects, that key finding, the shrinking gap between familiar and novel women, it just didn't happen for this group. And that really helped them isolate sexual arousal as the main driver.
So, what does this all mean when you put it all together? Well, it means the reality is way more nuanced than that simple, catchy claim that novelty is addictive.
You know, the study's authors really say it best themselves. They've found that their data just doesn't support that dramatic rewiring the brain story. Instead, it points to these subtle, specific, and short-term psychological effects that really depend on the context.
All right, so here's the bottom line. What do we actually know now? We know that, at least in a lab, being exposed to arousing content can temporarily make familiar faces seem a little less special compared to new ones. And what's still a big question mark? Pretty much everything else. We have no idea about the long-term effects, and we have no idea how rating pictures in a lab translates to how you feel about a real-life, long-term romantic partner.
And you know, this really gets to the core of the scientific approach. The goal isn't to make a moral judgment call to say this is good or bad. It's to move beyond the viral claims and show that the psychological effects of pornography aren't some mysterious, unknowable force. They are specific, they are nuanced, and they can be measured.
You know, the most practical thing we can take from this isn't just about porn. It's about how arousal itself can temporarily flatten how we perceive value, making the things we're familiar with seem a little less special. And that leaves us with a much bigger thought. This experiment was about images on a screen, but it raises a real question for all of us. In a digital world that offers us infinite novelty, how do we choose to find and protect the value in the familiar? Thanks for joining us.